Hello, my name is Louise Parbury. Everyone looked up from their phones. Welcome to this session on freer developers from data definition. So what I'm going to do is give you an overview of some of the scenarios that brought us to create a mechanism for analysts to move flat files through Ensemble and do things like do data transformations without having to do customized code for every single file, and some of the reasons behind why you would need to do that. So I'm going to give you a couple of real-life example use cases and what some of the developers do need to do in terms of creating infrastructure. So there is a bit of a configuration that you do need to use to make use of the mechanisms within Ensemble. What are the roles for the analyst users? And then how do you set up the data definitions within Ensemble and working with data transformations and lookup tables. And then I'm going to give you a demo of importing and data definition through the RecordMapper and through Ensemble without having to do any coding. And then we'll have time for questions at the end. So the scenarios we're thinking about here commonly are when you have trying to aggregate application data from multiple sources. So we've seen this where you've got your only means of access to the information is something that you don't own. So it's not a table that you've created. You have a source record, and then you need to be able to throughput it, transform it, and aggregate the information and do some reporting. So another common scenario is that when your data is evolving, so you have different versions. This is not from a development point of view. This is just from a fully deployed implementation point of view. So again, the data doesn't belong to you. You've been presented with version 1 and version 2, and you're going to then have to transform it into your own internal data format. And that these things are changing regularly. And this might be because of some kind of regulation. I work with the NHS, and so they have data formats which you need to import into your application, and they will do that every few months or so. And then they might be for other different governmental regulations, which means that your formats are going to be different. So the first example I'm going to talk about is in logistics. And this was an application partner who created a platform for being able to take supply chain data from, in the first instance, it was multiple depots. So you have hundreds of these different sites that are sending through information about orders, and they are all in different formats. And the reason for that is very common that you've got expansion through acquisition, and so they might have an application that's 10 years old, and their output EDI is going to be different from the next one that they've purchased, and so you can get lots and lots of different record formats. One of these things is that it's very common that the only way means that you can actually transfer the information is through secure FTP, and then they need to consolidate all the data, and they were doing it by transforming it into a common format, and then they needed to make a best guess of what that transmission would look like. So some of it was automated, and then some of it was confirmed by the analyst users. So they would validate that information as it went through. So they created an application for the analyst to confirm whether that data transformation was correct or not. And then they would generate reports from all of that aggregation of the information that went through Ensemble. The second use case is in healthcare, and what was happening is that the trusts were all making use of a hospital system that was located on site, and then part of a governmental program to get everyone to be able to use the same application across multiple sites. It was now hosted in a remote server. So what they were used to doing for years was being able to take the patient records and run lots of reports on them, and they need to do that for lots of regulatory reasons, and they need to send reports back to the government. But they weren't able to do that anymore because there was no ODBC connection. There's no querying tool that they could use against the hosted server. And there are like hundreds of reports that they need to do. So the mechanism that was done by the hosted servers was to provide secure FTP again, an output record of every single record transmission that actually went on in the source application, and do those transactional changes and give them various different comma-separated files for all the different types of tables. So patient administration, surgeries, waiting times, and then they could then feed those through Ensemble and do their reports that exactly the same as they were used to doing. So they would have to do a data transformation. Now, those don't change very often. You have like every few months, what they will probably do is add extra fields onto the end of the comma-separated file. So you might have version 1. Version 2 looks very similar to version 1 with extra information tagged on the end, but you've still got hundreds of these different tables. All right, so what they would do is feed those in through Ensemble, do the data transformation to the way the reports used to look, their old table formats, and then run all their statutory reports. So what we were trying to assist with is a lot of requests where people were saying, you know, we're trying to do this implementation work, but of course the developer is a scarce resource for us. So we see this a lot in NHS trusts where you have integration specialists, but they're a scarce resource and they have multiple jobs that they're doing. So that's not the only thing they're doing. So if you have this new file format coming through, then you're going to have to try and schedule your developer to do that implementation work. And then that was going to be too difficult because normally these statutory regulations come in and they want you to make those changes tomorrow, right? And so you don't have the flexibility to sit there and get those development resources to do the implementation right away. And the other thing we see a lot is that, you know, you've set up your implementation and then that developer moves on to a different project. Right, so they might be a consultant, or they might have just moved to a different company, they've left, and then you're going to have to figure out how you're going to get that resourcing done. Now, another advantage to thinking about making use of non-technical resource is that if you're making use of analysts, and there are always analysts in these kind of situations because they're the people who are having to produce the statutory reports, is that they know the domain, they know the data model, they know what the end output has got to be, and they know the importance of the data. So me as an implementation person, as far as I'm concerned, anything that's going through Ensemble is just a payload, and I'm not too worried about, I'm trying to get stuff from point A to point B, versus the analyst is knowing much more importance about being able to spot any errors in the information, any inconsistencies, and they should be in control of what the output looks like and spotting any errors in the source data. And there are cases where people make a change and suddenly that information is wrong, incompatible, and they have much better idea of what it should look like. And they should be in control because essentially if they're doing the statutory reports, then they're responsible for the output. Though you don't get off scot-free, you do need to have a developer at some point set up the framework in Ensemble to be able to configure all of your business components. So we're going to have we provide business services which still need to be configured, and then you need to figure out things about what is the throughput, which brings you to the decision about whether you're going to do them as single records or in batch. Right, because if you've got a few records at a time, then you can set them through as single records. If you're getting through, like with the healthcare example, millions of transactions, or thousands per day, then you're going to take up a lot of disk space if you're sending everything through as a single record, because you've got a header file and then you've got your message payload. So if you do it in batch mode, it's much more efficient. So somebody has to do that, and that's usually kind of a developer role versus an analyst role. And you're also going to have some kind of mechanism for dealing with errors. So data model errors, so wrong formats, or just something goes wrong in a data transformation, you're still going to need a developer who's going to have to set up the infrastructure. And they can do things like set it off to a human workflow so that somebody can decide whether they're going to discord that message again or have to manually make a change and send it through. So in Ensemble, the mechanism that we're using for the data model import, we call the RecordMapper. So we've had the RecordMapper for a while. This has been on Ensemble since version 2011. But what we're seeing now is that what people didn't quite recognize as a use for it, people have now taken and done implementations fairly recently. So whereas they might have been in a where they've had to do the coding themselves previously, and then a new project comes along and they're going, oh, I don't need to do that anymore, I can make use of the RecordMapper. So we did want to point out, again, this is why we're doing this session, is that we've had a very big, successful project that's just been implemented, making use of something we've had for a while. But I think there was a transition period where projects that I've done, we did it in customized code, and now you have to kind of wait for the next project to come along before you can take advantage of the RecordMapper. So we have inbuilt services and operations for dealing with the file formats and the two different types in terms of dealing with the single transaction or dealing with the batch records. And we have the graphical user interface, which I'll show you in the demonstration, which you don't need to be a developer to make use of. The only thing you do need to care about sometimes is about record lengths. So the default with an Ensemble maximum string size is 50. So you need to care about that. And once they understand what the format is for making it 250 or whatever it needs to be, then that's as much technical knowledge as the analyst needs to know to correct the information so that it'll work nicely without any errors. Then inevitably, then you make use of the standard Ensemble implementation for doing data transformations. So the format that you came in is not going to be the format that comes out, mainly because then you wouldn't be having a problem. You'd just be throwing through a flat file and good to go and importing it into a spreadsheet or whatever. So these usually are coming into two different types. You've got your single output, so you've got the new thing needs to be transformed into the old thing, which was the case of the healthcare example, where they had to make the new application's output look like the old application's output because the statutory reports were all based on the old format. And then the other type is where you have multiple outputs, which you're going to send to lots of different applications, which means you need to define what's called the canonical form. So you might have 100 different inputs, and then you're all going to transform into the same format, which is then read by other different applications, that they're all going to accept that canonical form. All right, this is a rare situation. It's always lovely when you can do that, but it's all going to depend on the outputs, the applications, whether they're going to accept the canonical form or not. And then the other thing that's fairly common is that you're going to work with lookup tables. Again, this doesn't have to be a developer role. This is something the analyst can do. There's going to be things like code tables. So what was like A in one source information has got to be B in a destination. So you need to have a lookup table that says if it comes in as A, it's going to come out as B. And then my favorite use case was a data migration fix. So this was not a planned implementation made use for the RecordMapper. This is something that the implementation specialist at the hospital asked if we could possibly do it completely by accident. So what happened was that they were changing a clinical system, it happened to be a radiology system, and they were going from one supplier to another, and there was a whole data migration project that was handled by the supplier. And what the data migration team forgot to do was run through the primary patient identifier. So essentially they forgot to put the NHS numbers through into the destination application. And then they disappeared. So they were gone, right? And to get them back would have taken weeks. So they said, would it be possible for us to, we have all of these identifiers available, just create a spreadsheet of the hospital number, which they did have, and the associated NHS number, and then send it through as an HL7 message. So as an EDI message, what we're going to do is just generate the HL7, which is an update message, and then that was the way of getting the NHS numbers through. So that took very little time to implement it all. You know, it was like a day where we were like thinking about the problem and how we were going to do it, and generating the spreadsheet. And then sending through the 600,000 records took a matter of minutes. So we essentially ignored all the people that had been dead for 7 years. So never mind, they were not going to be transferred anyway. And they wouldn't let me send them all through at once because I was going to go for the big bang. I was all excited about this invitation project, but they were kind of nervous, so they sent it through in chunks. But the first chunk only took 5 minutes, and then they sent them through, and the whole thing was processed on the source very quickly, and then the target system took a long time to process because, of course, it's doing a database update. Okay, so I was just going to show you a few things to do with the RecordMapper in Ensemble. What we have here, I've already gone to, I've already gone to the RecordMapper screen, the comma-separated value record wizard, and I have some sample files. Purely by coincidence, I happened to pick something that was space-related, nothing to do with the European Space Agency, but I was trying to come up with open data examples that were available publicly, because later on you can make use and download these files yourself. And since I'm a bit of an astronomy buff, I went for the ones I could find, which were the Messier files on your constellations. And I found 2 different spreadsheets that had the same information, but some extra ones in the other file. So you have your constellation, declination, and the catalog number. So you don't need to know all the full details for this, but you can see that the information looks like this in this spreadsheet, and in the other spreadsheet, it's slightly different. All right, so instead of M1, it's just got 1, and then it's got these codes for the constellations. Okay, so I'm going to select the spreadsheet file. I'm just going to give it a test name. I'm going to go for a sample, hits the header row, keep the SQL column order, and quote style escaping in use, which might not be for this one, it might be for the other file, but I'm going to tick it anyway. And you can see that it is made use of the file as an example, so you can see if it actually makes sense or not when you're looking at it. So again, no developer needs to be available to do this. You can get an analyst to do this, someone non-technical, and they can go through and validate, and if they need to add in that some things might be greater than 50 characters, then they'll need to know how to fill in that form. But we've got examples of that in the demo database anyway. Okay, and then they would then generate the data model. All right, so I'm not going to do that. I'm going to open one we've already done earlier. Okay, and so I've got both types now. I've imported and generated the data model for both of the files. So what I've done just randomly for no particular reason is decided that I'm going to transform from one file to the other file type. So I've picked one of them to be the canonical record form, and the one I've chosen to do that is the one that's actually got the constellations all spelled out instead of the codes. So this is my destination data model. And so if I picked for an input file, then I'm going to transform it to look like the other file. Okay, so here again, we've got a graphical user interface for someone who doesn't have to be a developer to be able to take the source records and connect them to the target. So I'm going to do something that's going to make probably no sense whatsoever, but you can see that you don't have to be a developer to do this. You do have to know to compile it. And the only thing we might need to do is how to make use of the lookup tables. So I'm saying I've got a constellation lookup table, which you can just do the data entry for that, which looks like this, and you're saying this code is for Aquarius, this code is for Cetus, Scorpio, et cetera, et cetera. I only did a few of them, all right? So once you've done that, then I've already done sort of a feed of the file through, because you see me dropping a flat file through. It's not particularly interesting. So I've got a visual trace of what I've been doing, and just to make sure, so we've got one here that's the Messier 2. Let's going to see what the source one for that one. So this one has the column was M, and the constellation column was AQR. And then when it comes out, then we've got one that's the M2, which has been transformed into the column name, and that the constellation is Aquarius, right? So very simply, you're just taking one format type and transforming it into the other format type. All right, and this is a very common scenario where obviously the receiving applications are going to need to see it in the accepted format in the data model. Okay, so it's worth having a look at the production for that. So it's in here. So I've got two demos merged into one production. But essentially, all we were having was the batch service, which is just looking at a particular directory, and is being sent through to a router, which is applying data transformation because it's in this business rule. And again, making use of business rules is something that an analyst can do. It doesn't have to be a developer. They just need to know that I'm sending through and applying this data transformation and sending it out to the business operation. Okay, so that's for a sort of single record comma-separated file. The other thing that we do is complex maps, and complex maps are more like EDIs, and I spend 99% of my time doing this through TCP, not through flat files, but there are cases where you've had to send file formats, complex maps through in files. So this is an example that's in the ENS demo, in our demo database, and it was a good enough example that I was just going to make use of it, and you can experiment with it as well. So this is about courses and students who've signed up for specific semester courses, and so you can see this is all done in different segments. So here we have a semester segment, and here's the student record, here's their list of classes, and then you get a repeating group, so then you got student with their classes, etc. All right. And I'm not going to show you setting up the map for that, but there is a business process in the middle of just for this particular demonstration, because some of the things you want to do is a bit more complex. So in that case, you've got multiple fields, multiple classes, and say you want to sum that up. Okay, so you want to count the number of classes or counting the number of students, and it's a bit more complex than if you just with the comma-separated file send it all through, and then your query can do all that aggregation for you. So here it's because it's all as a group of information. Sometimes you need to create a business process to be able to do all of that aggregation for you and send it through as a different message. So on the message trace for this one, we can see this has already done the complex map transformation, so it's taken the flat file format and turned it into XML. I'm just going to do that for a second. Okay, so it's got the semester and the students, and imported that information through. Okay, so that's the input, and then the data transformation that does some aggregation should be here, and it's doing things like counting up records, All right, so it's a completely different, it's not like taking two very similar files and doing a bit of a minor data transformation. This is actually doing some more complex business logic associated with the content of the EDI group values. Okay. And in that case, you may or may not need a developer for that kind of more complex business processing, but that's usually something that they're only going to be doing once, and maybe the source input will be subtly different. Okay, so we're trying to, as much as possible, make it so that you can have non-technical users who are doing subtle changes to changes in the source or target information for whatever reason, versioning, or suddenly you get a new data model, new depot comes in, and it's very similar processing, but you don't want to have to sit there and implement any code every time you're trying to do that. All right. So you still need to have developers somewhere in the mix, mainly because you might get errors that you've never seen before, and then you might need to put a new, different error type of trapping. So this is my all-time favorite error that I've ever had. So it says, Crab Nebula, remnant of supernova in the year 1054, length longer than max length allowed of 50. So I just sent that through as the sample data because I just left all the defaults on it. All right, so that's a very obvious one. And I'm guessing that somewhere in some project of implementation you're doing, you will get something where an analyst would just go, I have no idea what that means. So you need to go talk to your developers and find out what to do. So general further considerations are, what are the kind of secondary uses for that data? So it's not always necessarily an ensemble about taking source information and sending it to a whole bunch of different target applications. A lot of what we see when we're making use of the RecordMapper information is that you can do from within Ensemble the secondary uses. So you don't have to send it out to a data warehouse to do all the statutory reporting. You can do it all within Ensemble. And you have the good enhancements of being able to make use of our technologies. So you've got DeepC and INO to do the dashboards and the business intelligence without having to send it off to yet another system. You just have it all contained in one server. And the other thing you can make use of is workflow. So this is different from what I was talking about in terms of the error trapping, so whether you want to discard that message or not. This is based on the content of the information. Does that trigger some kind of action for a person to come in and be aware of? Okay, and that's all going to be about 18-week waits, or something about the information, which is either before or after you figured out your reporting, which might mean to have some human input into the fact that they get to be alerted about what's happening in the system. Okay, so what we're trying to do is give you a sort of high-level overview of the RecordMapper. So previously we were giving people lots of technical details about what the data model looks like underneath and the classes that it generated. What we'd like you to do is then, if you haven't done that before, then to make use of the developer community, see if any of these use cases are something in one of your projects, and if someone's done it before, you can ask about that. Make sure that if you've not seen it already, then go to the learning services, online learning, and we're going to put all of this content online for you to make use of, along with the recording. And we also have lots of different courses, maybe just in general about data transformations or lookup tables or business processes. So the whole together provides all of the content that you need to do the implementation. And please go and talk to the developers in the developer zone. So I've been told I need to specifically name, this is excellent, Dave Lovelock and James McKeith, who this is their particular area of expertise. So you're also free to come and talk to me afterwards as well. So do you have any questions? Is there a question?
You had up there, you talked about a batch record map. Is that any different than just sending it to a file and scheduling the file to run once a day? I mean, is there a really difference in that?
So the question is about batch record maps. So this is in terms of how is it processing each individual row. Okay. So you've got a file with 50,000